Nicole Kidman has filed for divorce from Keith Urban after 19 years of marriage. The court papers show the actress will remain the primary caregiver of the couple's teenage daughters.
For 19 years, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban stood as one of Hollywood's rare proofs that love could survive fame, distance, and addiction. They were the couple people pointed to when they wanted to believe marriages like theirs could last. So when the news broke that they were done, it did not feel like an ordinary celebrity split. It felt like the ending of a story millions of people had quietly been rooting for. And now, at 58, Nicole has finally spoken. Not with a tell-all, not with a list of grievances, but with a handful of careful words that, if you listen closely, say more than any tabloid headline ever could. Their story started the way so many great ones do, almost by accident. In January 2005, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were both guests at the Day USA Gala in Los Angeles, an event built to celebrate Australian talent making waves in America. Nicole was already one of the most recognized actresses on the planet, an Oscar winner with a resume most performers could only dream of. Keith, by contrast, was still climbing, a country singer with talent to spare, but nowhere near the global reach he'd eventually have. They were introduced that night. Two Australians a long way from home, and something shifted for Nicole almost immediately. She has said in later interviews that she felt drawn to him from the start. Keith, however, did not move fast. Months passed with no word from him, and Nicole began to assume the spark she'd felt wasn't mutual. She has since admitted she quietly nursed a crush during that stretch of silence, unsure if it would ever go anywhere. That slow burn uncertainty is part of what makes the next chapter of their story land the way it does, because when Keith finally acted, he didn't do it halfway. The moment has become part of their mythology. On Nicole's birthday, while she was staying in New York City, Keith showed up at her apartment door before sunrise, holding a bunch of gardenias. It was such a specific, deliberate gesture. Not a text, not a phone call, but a 5 a.m. appearance with flowers in hand, that Nicole has said it wiped away any hesitation she had left. She knew, right then, that this was more than a passing attraction. From there, things moved with the kind of momentum that makes a love story feel inevitable. By May 2006, Keith proposed. Nicole said yes. A little more than a month later, on June 25th, they were married in a candlelit ceremony at a church in Sydney, surrounded by family and friends from both of their worlds, her Hollywood circle and their shared Australian roots. Her children from her first marriage, to Tom Cruise, were part of the day, folding an old chapter of her life into the new one being written. For Nicole, the wedding also represented something quieter and more personal than the headlines captured. She had already lived through one very public marriage and divorce, her years with Tom Cruise, and had spent time afterward rebuilding a sense of who she was outside of that relationship. Marrying Keith wasn't just a new romance. It was a second chance at the kind of partnership she'd hoped for the first time around. Friends who spoke to the press in the years that followed often described her as more settled, more at ease in her own life, once Keith became part of it. That sense of having found solid ground again is part of what made everything that came afterward. The addiction struggles, the years of distance, and eventually the divorce, feel so much heavier when it finally surfaced. But even a wedding that beautiful couldn't hide what was coming. Only months after they married, Keith checked into rehab to confront a long battle with substance abuse that had followed him for years before he ever met Nicole. It was the kind of test that ends plenty of new marriages before they've had a chance to properly begin. Nicole didn't leave. She stayed, visiting him during his treatment and standing beside him publicly once he returned, choosing loyalty and support over walking away in a moment when many partners might have. Keith has since said that period nearly cost him the marriage entirely, an acknowledgement of just how close they came to losing everything before their story had barely started. That decision to stay gave their bond an early kind of proof, evidence, to both of them and to everyone watching, that whatever came next, they could weather it. It was an early triumph, but in hindsight, it was also the first sign of just how much strain this marriage would eventually be asked to absorb. Marrying Keith gave Nicole the chance to expand a family she'd already begun with her adopted children, Isabella and Connor. In 2008, she and Keith welcomed their daughter Sunday Rose. 2 years later, their second daughter, Faith Margaret, arrived. Nicole has spoken often about how grounding motherhood became for her, especially given how much of her life was spent on film sets scattered across the globe. Keith, for his part, folded his family into his music, writing songs that carried unmistakable references to Nicole and their daughters. A country star's version of a love letter, released one album at a time. While their household grew, so did their individual careers, and both of them were operating at a level few performers ever reach. Nicole took on roles that stretched her range in every direction, an Oscar-nominated turn in Rabbit Hole, then a pivot to prestige television that earned her a Golden Globe and an Emmy for Big Little Lies. She proved, repeatedly, that she could carry both a film and a limited series with the same intensity. Keith, meanwhile, was becoming one of the biggest names in country music. His albums topped the charts, his tours filled arenas, and his trophy case filled up with Grammys and CMA awards. He expanded his reach further by joining American Idol as a judge, putting his easy charisma in front of an audience that had nothing to do with country radio. All of that success came at a cost that's easy to underestimate from the outside. Time. Nicole's film shoots regularly pulled her away for months, to London, to Australia, to wherever a production needed her. Keith's tours kept him constantly in motion, city after city, night after night. They tried to close the gap the way most long-distance couples do. Video calls, letters, quick flights, just to spend a handful of days in the same room. When they could, they brought their daughters along or carved out stretches of uninterrupted family time. But no amount of effort fully erases distance. It just manages it. Their daughters, meanwhile, grew up largely outside the spotlight, a choice both parents seemed intentional about. Unlike some celebrity children who are photographed constantly from birth, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret were kept mostly private during their early years, appearing at select public events, but otherwise shielded from the kind of exposure their parents' fame could have easily created. Nicole has spoken about wanting her daughters to have as normal a childhood as possible, given the circumstances, prioritizing school routines, friendships, and stability in Nashville over the kind of jet-setting lifestyle her career might have otherwise demanded of the whole family. That instinct to protect her children from public scrutiny is a thread that runs all the way through to how she's handled the divorce itself, choosing privacy for her daughter's sake even when the public wanted more. In public, none of the marital strain was visible. They were the couple photographed holding hands on red carpets, leaning in close during award shows, exchanging the kind of glances that made gossip columns swoon. Nicole spoke about Keith as her deep, deep love, and credited their marriage as the best thing that had happened to her. Keith answered with songs and tributes of his own, and in interviews around the release of various albums, he often described Nicole and their daughters as the reason his own life had steadied after years of turbulence. To the outside world, they looked like proof that Hollywood marriages and blended families built across two very different industries could actually work. But glamour has a way of covering cracks rather than fixing them. Keith's struggle with substance use had been part of their relationship from nearly the beginning, and he has since acknowledged just how close that early chapter came to ending things before they truly started. Their ability to survive it became part of their legend as a couple, evidence to fans that whatever came next, they could handle it together. They built a beautiful family and achieved more success than most people manage in several lifetimes. But underneath all of it, the foundation was quietly shifting in ways neither of them could fully control. For years, Nicole and Keith made their careers work around their marriage, rather than let their marriage buckle under their careers. But as the years went on, the balancing act got harder to maintain. Nicole took on major projects that kept her overseas for extended stretches, including work on Practical Magic 2. Keith was deep into touring commitments of his own. The time apart, which had always been a challenge, started to stretch longer and closer together, until it began to outweigh the time they actually spent under the same roof. Signs of strain started leaking into public view, subtly at first. During a radio interview in Australia, on Adelaide's Mix 102.3, a host asked Keith a pointed question about Nicole's on-screen romantic scenes opposite younger co-stars, referencing her 2024 film A Family Affair with Zac Efron. According to the show's producer, Keith and his team disconnected from the call shortly after, declining to continue. It was a small moment, but it read as a larger one, a sign that questions about the marriage had become something Keith wanted no part of answering, even in passing. Nicole and Keith were last seen together publicly in June, at a FIFA Club World Cup match in Nashville, sitting side by side in what, at the time, looked like an ordinary night out for a couple that had weathered plenty of ups and downs before. Not long after, sources told TMZ that the couple had actually been living apart since the start of summer, meaning that public appearance may have already been one of the final ones before their separation became widely known. To the outside world, that kind of separation could be explained away as scheduling. Two people with demanding careers simply spending time in different cities, something Nicole and Keith had done countless times before without it signaling the end of anything. But to those closer to the situation, this stretch felt different. It marked a shift from a marriage stretched thin by distance to a marriage that had, quietly, already ended in practice before it ended on paper. Around the same period, Nicole's social media presence offered its own quiet clues. She posted a series of summer memories that noticeably excluded Keith, a departure from years of anniversary posts and tour photos that had once filled her feed. For a couple who had built so much of their public identity around visible affection, red carpet appearances, tributes and interviews, songs written about each other, the absence started to speak louder than anything either of them said outright. Fans and entertainment reporters picked up on the shift almost immediately, and speculation about the state of the marriage began building weeks before any official confirmation arrived. By the time summer turned to fall, the private separation became public record. On September 30th, court documents show Nicole filed for divorce from Keith in Davidson County Circuit Court in Nashville, Tennessee, the city both of them had called home for 2 decades. She cited irreconcilable differences, along with a reference to marital difficulties, language that offered little detail but confirmed what insiders had already been saying. TMZ was first to report the split, noting that sources described the couple as having lived apart since early summer. The filing named Sunday Rose, then 17, and Faith Margaret, then 14, as the couple shared children, and Nicole requested to be named their primary residential parent. Reports at the time painted a picture of a woman trying, up until the very end, to hold things together. One source close to the family told People magazine that Nicole had been fighting to save the marriage and hadn't wanted this outcome, while another source told Us Weekly that Keith had already emotionally moved on and had been open with Nicole about where he stood, describing the eventual split as something that had grown out of quiet distance rather than any single dramatic event. What followed was a settlement process that, by Hollywood divorce standards, moved remarkably fast and stayed remarkably civil. Court documents show that Nicole and Keith had actually signed a parenting plan back in August of 2025, weeks before the divorce was even formally filed. Evidence that they'd been working through the hardest logistical questions privately before making anything public. That parenting plan gave Nicole primary residential custody of their 2 daughters, allotting her roughly 306 days a year with the girls, while Keith received about 59 days, along with regular parenting time. Despite the imbalance in day-to-day custody, both parents agreed to make major decisions together. Schooling, healthcare, and other significant choices for their daughters would remain a joint responsibility. The agreement also included language stating that neither parent would speak negatively about the other, and that both would actively encourage their daughters to maintain close, comfortable relationships with each parent. As part of the settlement, both Nicole and Keith were required to complete a parenting education class within 60 days. On the financial side, both parties waived spousal support entirely. Court records also reference prepaid child support obligations tied to Keith, and both parents agreed to retain their own separate assets, a detail that strongly suggests a prenuptial agreement had been in place well before the wedding, quietly protecting both of their fortunes from the start. Given the scale of real estate the couple had built up over 19 years, homes in Nashville and other properties reflecting both of their careers, an arrangement like this meant far less courtroom conflict than many divorces of this size typically produce. The divorce was finalized on January 6th in a Nashville courtroom, just over 3 months after Nicole first filed. For a marriage that lasted nearly 2 decades and involved 2 of the most recognizable careers in entertainment, The speed and relative calm of the settlement stood out. Legal commentators pointed to the advanced parenting plan and the couple's mutual willingness to avoid a drawn-out fight as the reasons things moved as smoothly as they did. Here is where the story gets more complicated than most headlines suggest. Nicole did not sit down and explain, point by point, why her marriage ended. In fact, when she finally addressed the divorce publicly for the first time, in an interview months after the settlement, she made a clear choice to keep the specifics to herself. Speaking about her life since the split, Nicole said her focus was on protecting what mattered most, her family, and moving forward without dwelling on blame. She described herself as someone who's always going to keep moving toward what's good, and said that beyond her gratitude for her daughters and her determination to hold her family together in a new shape, she wasn't going to discuss the rest out of respect. She also made clear she has no plans to leave Nashville, the city she has called home for 20 years, and where she says her life and community remain rooted, regardless of what's changed within her marriage. She spoke with particular tenderness about her daughters, describing them as her darlings who have suddenly grown into young women, and said she's committed to keeping her family unit intact in whatever form that now takes. She also acknowledged that the months leading up to the public filing were quieter for her than people may have realized. She has said she was dealing with things privately, keeping to herself during that stretch rather than processing it publicly. So if the headline promises an admission, the honest answer is this. Nicole's real admission wasn't a confession of what went wrong. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to protect her daughters and her own peace by not turning her marriage's ending into public content, even while everyone around her clearly wanted the details. In a media landscape built on oversharing, that restraint says something in itself. It suggests a woman who has decided that her family stability matters more than satisfying public curiosity. Even now, even at 58, even after 19 years of being watched. Because Nicole herself has stayed guarded. Most of what the public understands about why has come from people close to the couple rather than from Nicole or Keith directly. And it's worth being clear about that distinction. According to sources who spoke to entertainment outlets in the weeks after the filing, the marriage didn't collapse over one incident. It eroded slowly, worn down by years of both of them living demanding, high-profile lives on opposite sides of the world. One insider described the split as something that had been building quietly for a long time, framing it less as a shock and more as something that had become, by the end, simply accepted rather than fought against. Another source suggested Keith had reached a point of acceptance well before Nicole had, and had been honest with her about where he stood emotionally even as she continued trying to preserve what they'd built. That gap between one partner ready to let go and the other still holding on is a familiar and painful shape for a marriage to take, and it lines up with reporting that described Nicole as someone who fought to save things right up until she couldn't anymore. Distance, unsurprisingly, sits at the center of nearly every account. 2 careers requiring global travel, 2 demanding schedules that rarely lined up, and years of managing a marriage through video calls and short reunions instead of daily life. It's the kind of strain that doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic rupture. It just accumulates, year after year, until the people inside the relationship look up one day and realize how much space has grown between them. What's notable is that none of the reporting points to scandal, betrayal, or any single explosive cause. That, in its own way, may be the most honest version of why available. Not a villain, not a single mistake, but 2 people whose lives simply stopped fitting together the way they once did, even while the love between them, by most accounts, never fully disappeared. It's also worth noting how differently this divorce has unfolded compared to so many other high-profile splits. There's been no public feuding, no dueling statements, no leaked messages designed to shift blame. Both Nicole and Keith appear to have made a shared decision, whether explicitly discussed or simply understood, to let the marriage end without turning it into a spectacle. That kind of restraint is rare in an industry where every relationship, especially one this closely watched, tends to become public property the moment it shows signs of trouble. For 2 people who spent 19 years being photographed, interviewed, and speculated about, choosing quiet over conflict may have been the last gift they gave each other, and perhaps more importantly, the last gift they gave their daughters, who will grow up without their parents' divorce having become a years-long tabloid war. Since the divorce, Nicole has leaned heavily on her family, particularly her sister, who sources describe as a steady presence throughout the split. Her daughters remain her clear priority, and she has structured her public comments almost entirely around protecting their stability rather than her own image. Professionally, she hasn't slowed down. Her upcoming projects include the sequel Practical Magic 2, along with television roles in Scarpetta and Margot's Got Money Troubles, suggesting that whatever personal upheaval she's navigating privately, her creative output remains as ambitious as ever. She's also continued to show up at high-profile industry events, including a widely covered appearance at Vogue World, standing alongside contemporaries like Angela Bassett and Julia Garner. Keith, by contrast, has said almost nothing publicly. He released his most recent album before the split became public, and aside from the radio interview he cut short, he has largely avoided addressing the divorce directly. That silence, paired with Nicole's carefully measured comments, has created two very different public postures. One parent choosing quiet reflection over spectacle, the other choosing to simply not engage with the subject at all. Under their custody arrangement, both remain actively involved in raising Sunday and Faith, even with the imbalance in day-to-day time. The joint decision-making clause means major choices about their daughters' lives, education, health, milestones, still require both parents at the table, whether they want to be there together or not. That's the quiet, unglamorous reality behind every divorce settlement like this one. The legal papers may close one chapter, but co-parenting keeps two people connected for as long as their children need them to be. For fans who followed Nicole and Keith for nearly 2 decades, the hardest part of this story may not be the divorce itself, but the realization that even the marriages that look the strongest from the outside are shaped by pressures no audience ever fully sees. Two people who genuinely loved each other, who stood by one another through addiction and distance and the relentless demands of global fame, still found themselves unable to close the gap that time and geography kept carving between them. There's no villain in that version of events, just two careers that never stopped pulling in different directions, and two people who eventually ran out of road. What comes next for both of them will likely stay just as private as the ending did. Nicole has made clear she intends to keep building her career and her family life in Nashville, the place she now describes as fully her own. Keith, based on everything reported so far, seems to be doing the same in quieter, less publicized ways, focused on his music and his relationship with his daughters rather than any public narrative about the divorce. Whether either of them ever says more about what really happened behind closed doors remains an open question, one that may never fully be answered. And based on how Nicole has handled things so far, that might be exactly how she wants it to stay. What Nicole Kidman's story ultimately offers isn't a scandal. It's a portrait of a woman choosing privacy in an industry that rarely allows for it, protecting her daughters, staying rooted in the city she calls home, and refusing to turn 19 years of marriage into a public autopsy just because the world is curious. Maybe that restraint is its own kind of answer. What do you think really pulled Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban apart after 19 years? Was it simply distance and time, or something neither of them has said out loud, something we may never actually get to hear? Let us know what you think really happened in the comments below.